I appreciate very much your patience, and we are all set to get started with our session 2 of day 3, focusing on early childhood assessment. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Johnny Pettigrew. I'm going to let her introduce herself in just a minute. As a reminder, as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them into the question section on the GoToWebinar control panel. If you are just joining us and we're not with us in our first session, a recording of today's session as well as certificates of attendance will be sent out to all attendees by the end of next week. And just a reminder that all attendees during our conference this week will be entered to win a kit of their choice, and that winner will be announced next week as well. So without any further ado, Dr. Pettigrew, why don't you get us started?
All right, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Riverside for hosting this. This is a phenomenal event. I'm so excited to be a part of the inaugural. If you look up at the screen, you'll see I'm in my office at work, because I am a working educational diagnostician in the state of Texas. I am employed by Denton Independent School District, and I am also an adjunct professor at Texas Woman's University. Let me just share with you some information about myself. I am old. I was a teacher before special education ever came into existence. I got interested in this field of early childhood while I was still in high school. I was about to start my senior year in 1965 when Head Start started. It was just a summer program. It was about a month before school started, and the funds were made available to have a summer program to help those children going into first grade know what school was going to be like. That's what got me interested. But there was nothing I could do with that interest. Special ed wasn't around. Not only that, early childhood education was not around. Any education for young children was always a private preschool. A teacher, retired teacher who was staying home with her kids would have a kindergarten class in her home. They were expensive. Most people could not afford them. Later on, I became one of the first gifted teachers in Texas, along with having been one of the first special ed teachers, then one of the first kindergarten teachers. I became one of the gifted education teachers. Now, diagnosticians are not a field you may know. In other states, they might be called a psychometrician or a psychometrist. In the state of Texas, when we started special education, we didn't have the field of school psychology. We had clinical psychologists, and they had to quickly come up with people who were qualified to administer the tests. They started with, excuse me, they started with speech therapists, taking the training to give IQ tests and achievement tests, and then expanded it so that you had to have a master's degree, and then you could take the 12 to 15 hours that were needed for test administration. I got my master's degree and took the courses, and I've been doing this for over 30 years. I love the field, and I'm not ready to quit. Sarah, if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So in this session today, what I want to do is talk with you specifically about the skills that an early childhood examiner needs. That's my area of specialization. I can give the test for a specific learning disability. I can look at an intellectual disability, but this is my field of expertise. This is my doctorate field, and it is my passion. I'm going to look at you with the skills that you already have and show you how you can use them. And then I want to talk with you about how the BDI-3 helps you in using these skills. So Sarah, go ahead and show us the next slide. We'll start with looking at the skill set that I use every day We'll look at the characteristics of these, and then I'm going to show you that all in one package, the BDI-3, that I use constantly. But before I do that, Sarah, pull up this next page. I want you to take a look at what early childhood assessment is. It's really a never-ending puzzle. What I started out doing 30 years ago has evolved, and it continues to evolve. About 10 years ago, I started dealing with the issue of children whose heads are always down on the iPad watching a video or playing a game, children whose parents would not interact with them because they were doing the same thing. Now I'm dealing with children who have not left their home. I tested one child who was delivered in the hospital, went home from the hospital, did not leave the house until he was 2 years, 11 months, and I was assessing him for services in the public school. All of his ECI services had been telehealth, and he had not been out. He had not seen anyone but mom and dad during the first years of his life. So now I'm encountering dealing with that social isolation that COVID created. It's a never-ending puzzle when you're working in the field of early childhood assessment. Next slide. This is adapted from a document that Texas Education Agency put out when COVID started, and I use it in the classes I teach at Texas Woman's University, but I've simplified it to look at this early childhood assessment with you. You know this, it's just may not have been organized like this. We have informal assessment sources that we use. There's curriculum-based, we have Criterion Reference, and we have the norm referenced. When you're doing an early childhood assessment, you may not have all of these. You might know the reason for the assessment. There may have been a hearing screening. Doctor may have sent the child to an audiologist because of a concern about autism. You'll have parent information, but you may not have the teacher. You may not have work samples. You don't have records to review unless the child has been in early childhood intervention. The observations that you get may be from a daycare provider who is only required to have a high school education. You may have a child who was in a more structured daycare where they do some monitoring of their progress. When you look at curriculum-based, there's very little available when it's an early childhood assessment. Those are what I've listed are the things that you might have for a school-aged referral. At the next part, the Criterion Reference, there are some tools that are available in Texas to daycares. One of them is the CLI Engage, but that's the only one unless they are using a structured curriculum for their program that has an ongoing monitoring of skills. Standardized assessments tend to be what most people that talk to me about early childhood assessment rely on. But I want to show you today how there are other strategies that you can use, other tools that you already have in your repertoire that you can use. Go ahead and take us to the next slide. One of the things is looking at what you've already got. You know about I know what I was saying here. You know those. The wheel I just showed you. You know those. Those are what you do in school already. But this is not a school-based referral. Go to the next slide. When you get this ECI referral or this parent referral on a preschool child, do you ever have this reaction? Do you ever go into panic mode? I don't have my sources of data. There's nothing from the teacher. I don't have any records to review. How am I going to determine eligibility? Let's see the next slide. Well, what I want you to do is to take a deep breath, because I'm going to tell you, you've got this. You've got the skills. Let's go to the next slide. Because you can do this. You're already doing observing. If you're doing a specific learning disability assessment, you're going into the classroom because that's a requirement. We have to do an observation. If you're looking at ADHD, you'll be doing an observation. You're also interviewing. You talk with the teacher to find out what are your areas of concern. You said reading was a concern. Could you talk to me more about that? You're interviewing the parent. You're interviewing, sometimes you get consent to call the doctor and talk with the daughter. And you're doing standardized assessments as well. Those are the 3 tools that an early childhood assessor uses. It's not anything new, it's something you know, but we're going to use it in a targeted way. We're going to take a look at those skills and see how specifically we would adapt them and use them for an early childhood assessment. Let's start, Sarah, with the next one. So you've got these skills. We're going to look at them, the characteristics. What data do you need? How do you get that data? And how do you use these skills to help you? Go ahead. Let's start with you observing. I love doing early childhood assessments and getting to go out on the playground or in the classroom and watching the child. I took a little girl out to the playground because her motor skills were a concern. I watched her transitioning across concrete to grass, to step up over a boundary around the playground area, and a new treat going on AstroTurf because the campus I went to got rid of the wood chips, no more wood chips coming in, and put AstroTurf instead. It is not something when you're doing an early childhood assessment that you can do in just a quick 5-minute session. You really have to be focused on the child, although some of the assessments, sometimes you could do that contrast. If I were looking at a child in a pre-K classroom, for example, where the teacher was concerned about off-task behavior, I would be observing a contrast child as well and making notes about that. Your observations in early childhood will become more developmental in nature. Sometimes, though, we are still doing those behavioral observations. Next slide. So this is just a list of the parts of a full individual evaluation. By observing, there are some of these that we can gather information. Language, for example. I can listen to a child interacting with their peers, answering questions from a teacher. I can gather information about their social emotional status by observing the language that they are using when they're angry. Do they lose their language? Do they begin to become physical towards the other children, using aggression rather than language? I can get an idea about cognitive skills, looking at the vocabulary level that they have, looking at them pretending to read a story. Am I hearing sentence structure? I can look at their adaptive behavior, which includes asking for help or telling the teacher, I need to go potty. I can get an idea of some beginning academic skills. They're in the book center. They are pretending to read the story. Are they retelling the story with relative accuracy? And then I can look at assistive technology. Are they using pictures to let the teacher know what it is that they want? Next slide. With the referral question, I can look to see what facts I can gather related to that referral question. For language, here's some strategies, some sources that I will be looking at, information that I will be gathering. Intelligibility, a lot of my referrals are because nobody understands what the child says. If I'm looking at intelligibility, I just write down every word that I understand. If I don't understand it, I make an X. And I can look at their social language. Next slide. For physical, vision and hearing are very difficult to assess for a young child. In the state of Texas, the nurses are trained to do a vision and hearing screening on a 4-year-old child. For a 2-year-old, almost 3-year-old, or a 3-year-old, understanding raise your hand when you hear the beep is not something that they can do. Observing, I can look at fine and gross motor, how they move in their environment. Something as simple as how you get in and out of a chair or how you sit in circle time. Sociological, we don't have home language surveys for children that are referred to us for an early childhood assessment. So I have to use parent information, but also my observation. If the child is only speaking English, and the parent has a translator, but the parent says the child speaks only English at home, then I wonder about the accuracy of the report. Next slide. Social emotional, do they initiate the social interaction? Can they sustain the social interaction? Am I seeing characteristics of autism or ADHD or emotional disturbance characteristics? I talked about cognitive. Play skills are the focus of cognitive development in my observation. I'm looking at how complex their play is. Is it multi-sequenced? Am I seeing problem solving? For example, I did a child last week where she is deaf. She has bilateral cochlear implants. She did the most intricate problem solving, putting the rings on the standing post in my Battelle 3 kit. She kept at that one activity until she got them in the right order. And that was the most persistent that I saw from her. Next slide. Adaptive behavior, that's the self-care skills. I usually have snacks when I'm doing my early childhood assessment so that I can watch the child pick up small pieces of food and eat them. I also have a drink available in a small little bathroom cup to see if they are able to drink. I talked about the readiness skills already, and then assistive technology. I would be more apt to see that use of assistive technology, the pictures, if I were in a daycare, or if the child was getting outside speech and the speech therapist was beginning to use the picture exchange communication system with the child, or even have advanced to using an iPad with something like Proloquo. Next slide. Back to plugging into our grid, looking at my informal work samples, the scribbling that they did in the art center, their play preferences. I can look at all developmental domains. If I look at the curriculum based, I look at what would be appropriate for a child, any private therapy monitoring, screenings that were done by daycare, curriculum progress monitoring for the daycare. For Criterion Referenced, the CLI Engage is what I would use in Texas, but some Head Start programs might use the Brigance or another screening instrument. I'm working with the Head Start program where I am on looking at some different tools, including the screening element of the BDI-3. Head Start is required to screen every child going into their program. And then looking at norm referenced, these are some of the ones that are used in my district, in the which is a public school. The developmental assessment for young children, the developmental profile, 3rd edition. My program right now, Head Start, is using the Dial 4, but there are other assessments. The language measures, I'm using the BDI-3. If that shows me that I need other assessments, then age-appropriate assessments would be what I use. Next slide. Interviewing. Interviewing is a large part of what I'm doing with my parents for ECI transition evaluations. I do it first. I start with when the transition meeting happens, and I am interviewing them to find out what their concerns are. When we're looking at interviews, there are 3 different types: the fully structured, the semi-structured, and the unstructured. We're going to look at each of the characteristics of these and see how they might be incorporated into the early childhood assessment. Go ahead, Sarah. The fully structured is a set of questions that is given to every respondent. They are given consistently, regardless of their response. An example of that would be like when I was writing my dissertation and I was interviewing parents of the children in my case that were part of my research case. Every parent had to have the same questions asked, and I simply recorded their responses. They were analyzed later. Go ahead. Semi-structured is a set of questions, but you may adjust depending upon what the parent responds. For example, the Vineland might be an example of one where it is more semi-structured. I remember doing an evaluation once where I asked the parent about the child being able to follow the directions to make a cake. And she said, as long as it has pictures. And I asked her to explain. And it turned out that the mother was a non-reader. And so the pictures were important for her. Go ahead. Unstructured is just where when I do a transition meeting, I say to the parent, tell me what is your biggest concern about your child. And then I guide the parent through with a set of questions designed to get the parent to elaborate so that I can more fully explore. It's not really a structure. There's no set questions that I ask, although I do try and make sure that I've given the parent opportunity to tell me everything that they want to tell me. Go ahead. So when we're doing an interview, you may think, I can't do this, but you've already experienced this. I'm an assessment specialist. So I've done at least 2 interviews, and you probably have as well. Now, some of you are not required to be classroom teachers in order to have your position. In Texas, a diagnostician, my position, has to have been a classroom teacher. So I had an interview when I was hired as a classroom teacher. I also had an interview when I was hired as an educational diagnostician. Go ahead. That type of interview is a fully structured interview. Right now, a lot of interviews are still being done via a Zoom meeting or a GoToMeeting or some other method, Teams meeting. In that type of interview, there's a set of questions that every person who comes in is asked. The interviewees may make notes, but there really is no change in the questions that they ask. At the end, you may have been given an opportunity to ask questions, and they may come up with an additional question specific you to ask. That type is fully structured, a set of questions to be asked of everyone. Go ahead. For the position, these are the questions, teaching position, these are the questions I got asked. What were my organization skills? Talk to us about your discipline. Talk about how you build rapport with parents and how you deal with a struggling student. What support would you need from administration, and how would you differentiate for a special education student in your class? When I was interviewed for my first diagnostician position, these were the types of questions I was asked. Go ahead to the next. There we go. Again, my organization skills, but this time I got asked about a difficult art and how I would deal with it. Now in Texas, because we are bigger and better than everybody else in our mind, we came up with a different name. We called it an ARD back when we first started because our administrators were too confused with the IEP meeting having an IEP developed in it. So they came up with Admission Review and Dismissal Committee meeting. Then they asked me what support did I think I would need and what would I use in an SLD referral. I'm old enough that it was a simple difference. You take the IQ, you subtract the achievement score. If they got a 16-point difference, then they qualify. But now the questions are more like this, wanting to know what assessment tools might you use and what method might you use for specific learning disability. And then I was asked, what information would you want from general education when you receive a referral? Next question. Looking at commonalities across these, they both were a team interview. They both included people that were part of my future supervision staff, and they had a rubric that they were following. We don't typically use this type of an interview in the early childhood assessment. Go ahead. Both of them were looking at a specific set of skills, but they were different sets of skills specific to the interview. Go ahead. The semi-structured is more like what I did when I was a kindergarten teacher out on the playground dealing with a fight between two children. Go ahead, Sarah. In that type of interview, the semi-structured, I've got a general idea about how I'm going to approach it, but it's going to shift depending upon what I learned when I first start out. It's kind of a punishment fits the crime, but I've got to know what the crime was first. Next slide. The unstructured is like a cold call, where you're an insurance salesman and you're given a list of numbers and you call them up to find out about, are they interested in life insurance? Or right now in Texas, there's a plethora of cold call. Would you like to sell your house? We're looking for land to develop for a new housing development. I live out in the country and I've already seen 5 farms sell off with 10 houses on each of those farms. So no, I like my 2 acres. I'm not interested in selling my house. Next slide. With the unstructured, it's really exploratory. There are no set questions. That's my transition meeting. Go ahead. It could be a phone call. These are some examples. It could be a phone call to your mother. You never know how that phone call is going to go. It could be a phone call to your child. My daughter will talk about anything and never answer the question I ask her. It could be a phone call to your significant other or to your physician. Next slide. They're different, but they're the same because there's in all of those phone calls, there's a plan. I call up a family member to get a specific answer. I call up my daughter to get an answer. My physician to find out my lab results. They're different in their focus, but they're still the same because there is a goal. Next slide. When you're planning an interview, there's a process that you need to go through. You need to think about what is the objective of your interview. I'm going to use my transition meeting. I want to know what the parent's concern is. I want to gather information about the things the child likes to do because I like to sabotage my testing environment for a young child. I like to have a toy out on the table that they like to play with to get them to come in and immediately start exploring. I really want to use my plan for this transition meeting to help me to stay on track, to guide me through the questions. I try and touch on all of the developmental domains. They're open-ended questions because I'm asking the parent to share information with me. Next slide. I open it up. I do the main body interviewing, and then I close. Now, my district requires that I explain the process of transitioning, what's going to be happening. Then we do the main body of the interview, and then I close it with asking if they have any other questions, anything else that they want to share with me. Next slide. I start with introducing myself. I identify myself with the school. I talk a little bit with them, build some rapport, go on to the next slide. And then my plan is to always have about 3 topics that I want to focus on, make sure I get those. I'm still focused on building the rapport. One of the biggest things is building the trust in an interview. Go ahead. The closing, you begin to wind down. Instead of just saying, oops, time for my next phone call, goodbye. You go back over, make sure you recorded everything correctly, meaning my notes, and then I thank the parent for sharing information with me about their child. Go ahead. The questions are open-ended and sometimes closed-ended, but most often they are open-ended. Go ahead. Open-ended questions are just that. There's no right or wrong. It's going to flow. Whatever they give me, I may lead to the next question. I really try and use them, the open-ended, more for chronological order. Like, when did you first become aware that your child had a delay in language development? What steps did you take next? When did ECI start? When did the private speech therapy start? Getting the chronology. Next slide. The closed-end questions are these are the ones that are really more readily used when you already know the objective of the interview. I use these more in scheduling the appointment. I've already done the open-ended. I've already gotten that information. And then when I'm ready to schedule, it's more closed because I need specific information. Next slide. My recommendations are use the broad open-ended questions when you begin because they're the least leading. You're not fishing for specific information. The parent doesn't get that perspective. Use the more specific closed end as you need more specific information. You'll develop, if you're not already doing this, the ability to switch back and forth between the two. Next question. Next slide, excuse me. Probing questions, could you tell me a little bit more about that? You said that you had concerns about autism. Could you tell me more about that? What are you seeing? Next slide. Here's just some examples for you of different types of questions that you could use in the process of doing an interview. I use the revisiting a lot. Let's go back to what you told me about autism. That's one that I do a lot because that happens all the time. We bring a child in and then the parent says, well, the pediatrician sent us to ECI because they think he has autism. Okay, and we're talking something else and then we go back. Next slide. Motivating questions are ways that you can open up. I'm trying to understand why you refer your child for an evaluation. That's kind of threatening. More inviting, more comfortable for the parent is something like, I have information from the school staff about your child, but I don't know your perspective. Would you have time to talk with me about what your concerns about your child? Acknowledging the parent and letting them be a part of the assessment. That's really critical in the early childhood piece. Go ahead. Biased questions, we want to avoid those. You know that research indicates reading to your child before they start school is critical for their development of foundational skills, don't you? I might say that to the parent who spends all the time on the iPad. I would not say that, but I have heard that. Next slide. Your communications style, these are between strangers. They don't know you. There could be a mismatch, so you need to be aware of that. You may need to adjust the complexity of your language. Avoid using idioms, similes, metaphors, jokes, colloquialisms. Never assume that a term is understood. You know, as evaluators and as people who work in the special education field, we have our own vocabulary, and we don't think anything about throwing that vocabulary around. But avoid doing that when you're interviewing a parent. It's like I constantly say ARD, and when Head Start came to do a site monitor, they had no idea what I was talking about. So I had to change my vocabulary to be IEP meeting. Next slide. It's important that you build that rapport, that they trust you, and if that happens, you will have a more open and honest interview. Next slide. I'm not going to go through this with you. I want you to know that this is here. It is a way that you can use strategies to use to build rapport with a parent. Next slide. Nonverbal cues, it's important that you look at their nonverbal cues. A parent who comes in, sits down and crosses their arms in front and glares at you, that is one that I would need to work with to get them to feel comfortable with me, to know I am not threatening them. Next slide. You need to engage in active listening. You've probably heard this before. I'm just reminding you, same thing is true for an early childhood assessment. Next slide. More strategies to use: reflecting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. Next slide. Here's a good checklist to make sure you are engaged in active listening. Next slide. Interview. So what data can we get? Still looking at the same pieces of our FIE. Next slide. More information about the referral question, more information about home language, private speech therapy. Next slide. Motor skills, confirming those. How old was the child when they started walking? Sociological, be careful when you're interviewing about sociological, and particularly with lack of educational opportunity. Age appropriate for a preschool age child is in the home or in the daycare with their parent. Next slide. Social emotional. One of the questions now that I ask is, during the pandemic, did your child have the opportunity to be around other people? And then cognitive, I really don't get much information in an interview related to that except for their play. Next slide. Adaptive behavior. For a preschool child, the parent is going to be a primary source. And then for their academic readiness skills, the parent gives me information like, are they scribbling? Are they interested in ABCs? Next slide. And assistive technology, particularly if a child has, for example, cerebral palsy, I may want to know about their walking, a wheelchair. Are they using a wheelchair? Are they using a walker? If they're in private speech, what has the private speech therapist said? Next slide. Well, now we are ready to look at standardized testing. Next slide. You know standardized testing, you know the characteristics of it, you know that it's a set procedure. We do that standardized administration. Next slide. We can get lots of information that we need from standardized assessment, all of those areas. Sarah, let's click through the next slides. I'm not going to go over the questions because you know this, but what I do want to do is show you my favorite early childhood assessment tool, the BDI-3. Go to the next slide. Now, I've been using it forever. Back in 1984, when I was in a kindergarten classroom, I wanted a way to monitor the progress of my children. Diagnostic Learning Materials, DLM, was a company in Allen, Texas. They were the publishers for the Battelle Developmental Inventory. It had all of the domains that it does now. I had my technical manual, and there is one piece that I do not have a picture of. My manuals have crumbled. The pages have gotten so yellow and brittle that I can't touch them. My screening manual disintegrated, because that was the one that I used constantly at the beginning of the year. Now I've gone from the Battelle to the Battelle-3, and there is light years difference. When I first got it, I had to use the toys that were in my classroom, and then DLM created a kit. We're going to look at the Battelle-3 and how it uses those early childhood assessment skills. Next slide. The Battelle Developmental Inventory is a play-based assessment. It uses all of those skills in a very structured way. Go ahead, next slide. This is just a collection of toys. They have them organized much more neatly. I just kind of spread stuff out. Next slide. It is play-based. It still has the same developmental domains. There's new stimulus in the books. It has online scoring, and I haven't done this yet. You can give it on an iPad. I'm excited for that piece, but I have to spend a little bit more time learning how to do it. Next slide. The book's layout has changed. It is the easiest. The Battelle has been from the Battelle to the BDI to the BDI normative update. This is the easiest, most user-friendly. The administration procedures are right there. The starting point is identified. What I read is consistently printed in the Woodcock-Johnson Riverside Publishing turquoise, so I know exactly where to go. My scoring criteria is right there on the page. Next slide. The scoring. This is the Riverside login. When you log in, you'll see down at the bottom right now with the, I'm teaching the WJ4 in my assessment class. This is the last week for class. The Woodcock-Johnson battery comes up. That's the logo that comes up. When you have the BDI-3 and you have subscribed to the program, then the BDI pops up and you click it to do your BDI scoring. Next slide. It's the same format, the same setup for a dashboard. It was the most intuitive to be able to use. So simple because I already knew how the platform was going to look. Next slide. There's different report options that are available for you. Go to the next slide. Now, this is looking at it from the iPad perspective, where you can use it on the iPad. I'm just learning this, but it's very intuitive. It's has the most logical flow, unlike another company's. I think once I have finished what I deem an appropriate amount of training, I'll be able to do this without any difficulty. Next slide. So I want to open this up and allow you to ask questions. I want you to know how to get in touch with me. I am an employee of Denton Independent School District. You can email me anytime. If I decide to retire, I'll still be working at Texas Woman's University. It's the same thing, jpettigrew@twu.edu. Go to the next slide, Sarah. I don't think I put anything else there. Oh, questions. Okay. So are there any questions, Sarah, in the chat room?
There is one that says, is there a way to use the BDI3 with Spanish speaking students? I can answer that question.
Yeah, I'm working
Yes.
right now with my bilingual assessors to get the BDI kit for them.
Yes. So we are launching a BDI3 Spanish in September that will be available in just a few weeks. So look for that. That is to come, and that is a perfect way to use the developmental assessment approach with your Spanish speaking students. Another question, I think this is probably, you know, a very pervasive question about, you know, over the last few years, but particularly in the early childhood space. And that is the question of differentiating between developmental delays and sort of skills that have not developed as a result of the pandemic related social isolation or lack of opportunities, or what is your approach to sort of teasing out whether or not a kiddo is not demonstrating a specific skill because they've not been exposed or because they actually are delayed in the acquisition of that skill?
You're absolutely right. This is a big question in our field right now. I use my interviewing skills. For example, the child that I talked about, that from the time he was born and went home, he had never been out of the house. I knew that what mother was reporting, some of the social emotional skills are interview questions. So I knew that some of those where mother was saying, no, he doesn't show any awareness of other children. That child's not been around other children. Another example would be, does your child approach other children? The child is scared of other children because he's never been around them. So I'm documenting that in my write-up. When I prepare my full individual evaluation, I report that, and then I also create a structured play session between myself and the child to see if the child will begin to do some initiation. If the child is in a daycare setting, or if I'm doing the assessment on one of our early childhood campuses or a classroom where there is a pre-K classroom, I may take the child into the pre-K classroom to see how they react to being around other children. I always clear that first with the principal and with the pre-K teacher in order to be able to do that. But just the documentation that you do in your write-up, more difficult to do it when you're looking at, is this a cognitive delay? Particularly if you know that this is a child that has a very limited supply of toys to play with. That's also hard to determine. It can be an intrusive interview question to ask with the parent, but I have a variety of toys out in my testing environment. If they don't know what some children have never seen a puzzle. So when I present them with a puzzle, then I have to determine, is this a lack of exposure or is this a deficit? In that case, I would ask mother, has your child ever played with puzzles? If she says, no, we don't have puzzles, then I conclude it is a lack of opportunity. That was a very good question. That's a research study for somebody.
Right, right. So how long, you've been doing early childhood assessments for a really long time. How long did it take you to sort of truly feel comfortable working with the littles as opposed to, you know, someone coming maybe with more familiarity with the school age population?
Sure. My first position as a diagnostician was just doing SLD evaluations. It was probably about 6 years before I ever started doing any early childhood. And they were mostly very structured assessments. None of the interview, none of the observation, except for the play that the child did in my classroom. Now I'll give you an example. We had a child come in that we were evaluating for autism, and we were using the Psychoeducational Profile 3rd edition. We could not get him to engage with anything, so we immediately shifted to a less structured play-based assessment with him. And then after the assessment, we debriefed and talked about the characteristics that we saw. I would never have done that 20 years ago. I did not feel comfortable enough with what I'm doing. And, you know, I've been doing it for over 30 years. That's 10 years into my career before I ever felt fully comfortable with what I was beginning to do. I think part of it is doing my dissertation, working on that field. I was looking specifically at the characteristics of autism as they related to children with a specific type of expressive language delay.
So there's a sort of a related question. Are there any good websites or online resources for a school psych new to the pre-K early childhood assessment field? This person's also moving from school age to early ed. So any resources you can recommend?
Okay, I'll have to look the name of it up. There is a website that has Tucker Turtle.
Tucker Turtle.
I'm looking for it right now, huh? Tucker Turtle. It's challengingbehaviors.cbcs.usf.edu. They have a whole wealth of materials. Tucker Turtle is a turtle puppet that you make. It gives you the directions on how to make it. And when Tucker gets anxious, he pulls his head in. They give you a lot of other behavioral strategies as well. There's a whole series of social stories using Tucker Turtle that are in on that website, and it looks at a lot of other behaviors as well. The Head Start program is required to provide mental health support to children, and ours is part of a district. Because we were early childhood, they said we didn't need a school counselor. So we would have to contract with psychologists to come on campus to do the mental health component. And Tucker Turtle, that website was one that I always sent them to learn about early childhood and how to help deal with some of the behaviors and feelings that young children have. I think it also has on their website a good bibliography of children's literature that you can use with them.
Excellent. I put the website in the Q&A as well. So
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think we are at time. I want to thank you so much again, Dr. Predigue, for sort of walking us through the skills that we may need that are different for our early child evaluations, but really leveraging all of our prior knowledge that we bring to sort of assessments in general. Thank you to our attendees. And I would like to invite you to day 4 of Evalu8, where we're going to be focusing on equity in clinical practice tomorrow. We have 2 sessions, a student-centered approach to social emotional learning and fair and equitable assessment strategies for working with English learners. We also have taken the opportunity to create a LinkedIn group that's called Psych to Psych, a Riverside Insights Network, which will allow you to connect with the speakers from this week and other clinical practitioners. And you can join this forum to share insights, ask for support, and to continue the conversation on important topics. So that is another resource that we're offering to keep the conversation going and provide you with those professional connections that will help you ultimately in your practice. Thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you again tomorrow, and have a great rest of your day.
And thank you, Riverside Insights, for this platform. Greatly appreciated.